How does a nation that was founded on the idea of liberty end up tearing itself apart over the institution of slavery? Well, it certainly didn't happen overnight. You see, the American Civil War was really the final, catastrophic result of a deep crack in the nation's very foundation. It was a crack that just kept getting wider and wider over 75 years of expansion, political deals, and mounting crises. Today, we're going to explore that story, how a republic full of contradictions was pushed right to its breaking point, and what happened when it was all hastily put back together again.
So here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll dive into those early contradictions baked into the country from the start. Then, we'll look at all the frantic attempts to patch up those growing cracks. After that, we hit the breaking point, where the talking stopped and the violence began. Then, we'll get into the war itself and Lincoln's incredible vision for a new kind of nation. And finally, we'll see how the crucial, difficult work of Reconstruction was just abandoned.
You know, our story doesn't really start with a battle. It starts with land, a whole lot of it. See, the early United States was growing at an incredible speed, and with every single new piece of territory, one question became absolutely impossible to ignore. Is this going to be free land, or is this going to be land worked by enslaved people? And that one question started to shine a massive spotlight on the nation's deepest, most fundamental conflict.
So let's kick things off with a real head-scratcher. How can the simple act of buying land turn one of America's most famous founding fathers into a huge hypocrite, and, in the process, set the stage for decades of conflict to come?
Okay, so here's the deal. President Thomas Jefferson was a guy who famously believed in a super strict reading of the Constitution. If a power wasn't explicitly written down in that document, he believed the government simply didn't have it, period. But then, in 1803, he got the chance to buy the massive Louisiana Territory from France, a deal that would literally double the size of the country overnight. And he jumped on it. The problem? The Constitution says absolutely nothing about a president being able to just go out and buy foreign land. He did it anyway. And in doing so, he showed that expansion was more important than his own principles, etching one of the very first deep cracks into the foundation of the young republic.
So what do you do when you buy a piece of land bigger than your entire country? Well, Jefferson sent out Lewis and Clark to figure out what he just bought. I mean, their to-do list was incredible. Find a water route to the Pacific, map everything, document all the new plants and animals, make contact with native tribes, the whole shebang. But hanging over this whole amazing journey was one giant unspoken question. As all this new territory eventually became states, would they be free states or would they be slave states? That single question would come to define the next half-century of American history.
So how did the country try to handle this growing problem? Well, for decades, the answer was basically political duct tape. Politicians just tried to seal the widening crack with a series of desperate, temporary fixes that they called compromises. But as we'll see, they were anything but a permanent solution.
You can see it right here. For over 30 years, from 1820 to the 1850s, Congress kept trying to find some kind of magic formula to keep the number of free states and slave states perfectly balanced. But each fix was just a Band-Aid, really just kicking the can down the road, and, honestly, making the next crisis that much worse.
All right, so the first big attempt was the Missouri Compromise. The deal was pretty straightforward. To keep the power balanced in the Senate, Missouri would get to come into the Union as a slave state. But to balance it out, Maine would be carved off of Massachusetts and admitted as a free state. And here's the crucial part. They drew a line across the country, the 36-degree 30-minute parallel. The idea was that any new state north of that line had to be free. They were trying to solve a deep moral problem with a line on a map, and it wasn't going to hold for long.
So why didn't that line on the map hold? 2 words: manifest destiny. America just kept getting bigger. After winning the Mexican-American War, the U.S. gained a huge new chunk of territory in the Southwest. And then gold was discovered in California. Suddenly, California's population exploded, and it demanded to enter the Union as a free state, which would have completely shattered that fragile balance. The old fix was officially broken, and the nation was, once again, right on the brink of collapse. By the time we get to the 1850s, that political duct tape wasn't just peeling off, it was actively making things worse. The debate moved out of Congress and into the streets. It turned into brawls and courtroom showdowns, pushing the nation right past the point of no return.
So what was the next big idea? It was something called popular sovereignty. Now, on the surface, it sounds pretty democratic, doesn't it? Just let the people who actually move into the new territories vote for themselves on whether to allow slavery. Simple, fair, democratic. I mean, what could possibly go wrong? Yeah, so what went wrong? Turns out everything. Popular sovereignty didn't lead to a peaceful democratic vote, it created a literal war zone. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery partisans flooded into the Kansas territory, not to settle down and farm, but to fight and to stuff the ballot boxes. The result was a bloody, miniature civil war that became known as Bleeding Kansas. This democratic solution was just pure gasoline on the fire.
And just when you think things can't possibly get any worse, the Supreme Court decides to weigh in. In the 1857 Dred Scott decision, Chief Justice Roger Taney delivered one of the most infamous and shocking rulings in American history. He wrote that Black people were, in his words, a subordinate and inferior class of beings who had no rights which the white man was bound to respect.
I mean, the impact of this was just devastating. First, it declared that African Americans, whether they were free or enslaved, were not citizens and could never sue in federal court. Second, it stripped Congress of any power to ban slavery in the new territories. That meant that the Missouri Compromise, that line on the map, was officially unconstitutional and void. In one single decision, the highest court in the land had essentially legalized slavery everywhere in the country.
At this point, you could just feel it. The time for talk was over. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860, who ran on a platform of simply stopping the expansion of slavery, not even ending it, was the final straw. For the Southern states, his victory was a direct threat to their entire economic and social system. And so, one by one, they began to leave the Union. The breaking point had finally been reached.
The Civil War wasn't just about forcing the South back into the country. For Abraham Lincoln, it became something much deeper. It was a fiery test, a chance to melt the nation down to its core and reforge it without that original fatal flaw.
This was the moment that changed everything. With the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln fundamentally transformed the entire purpose of the war. It was no longer just a fight to preserve the old Union as it was. It was now a moral crusade to destroy slavery and create a new Union. He declared that all enslaved people in the rebellious states shall be thenceforward, and forever free. The war now had a new, profound meaning. A few months later, standing on the horrific battlefield of Gettysburg, Lincoln gave a voice to this new vision. He spoke of a new birth of freedom, completely reframing the nation's entire purpose. The war, he said, was a test to see if a nation born in liberty could even survive. And he rededicated the country to that powerful idea that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
But, winning the war was one thing. Actually rebuilding the nation, a massive undertaking we call Reconstruction, was something else entirely. And just as that monumental task was getting underway, it was cut short by one last cynical political deal. So, in 1876, the presidential election was an absolute train wreck. It was incredibly close, filled with accusations of fraud from both sides, and it threw the entire country into a constitutional crisis. For months, nobody knew who the next president was going to be, and there were genuine fears that another conflict could break out. The whole crisis was finally solved with a secret backroom deal, the Compromise of 1877, and it was a shockingly simple trade-off. The Republicans got their guy, Rutherford B. Hayes, into the White House, and what did the Southern Democrats get in return? The complete withdrawal of all federal troops from the South. And those troops were the only thing on the ground protecting the civil rights and the safety of newly freed African Americans. Removing them meant only one thing: Reconstruction was over. And that brings us to our final unavoidable question. A war that cost more than 600,000 lives was fought for a new birth of freedom. But the project of actually building that new nation, of finishing the job, was abandoned for political convenience. The crack in the foundation was just papered over, not truly repaired, leaving a legacy of unfinished work for generations to come. So, what does it mean when a nation wins a war, but then simply walks away from the peace?